most of the 20th century, humanity has basked in its warm blue glow. Day after day, night after night, it has been a constant companion and trusted resource, a portal to other times, places, and ideas. From the very beginning, there were detractors: the mothers, the fathers, the teachers, the clergy, the press, the Amish, each uttering the same familiar phrase.
TV will rot your brain.
Rot your
brain. Absolutely, TV will rot your brain.
TV
will rot your brain.
TV will rot your brain. Everybody knows, TV will rot your brain.
Was it just a cliche, an old wives' tale, an urban myth? Was there any science to this claim? Could TV literally decay, decompose, degenerate, disintegrate, putrefy, wither, and waste the human brain?
There is no question that television has a physiological impact on the brain at the level of hurting the brain, deteriorating your mind activity. The mind turns into mashed potato.
Is it conceivable that this has been part of its purpose all along? And if so, who was behind it? And perhaps more importantly, why?
TV is a drug, right? It's crack. It's crystal meth squared, right? It's the worst thing in the world for your brain. And we've had it for 50 years, and it's pretty much kind of turned us into quasi-zombies.
The question is, what for? Just to sell us products? I don't think so. There's something deeper in this project.
Television as a plot to turn human gray matter into goo matter? On the surface, it seemed preposterous, the kind of far-flung conspiracy worthy of today's internet. But the clues were piling up long before, as far back as the very history of the medium itself. 3 television channels became 5. 5 became 13. 13 became 300. And finally, the birth of 24-hour cable TV. Hundreds of channels filled with relaxed standards programming. Around-the-clock TV paired with the perfect way to sleep in front of it. Could those flickering blue rays be tampering with brain tissue even as people slept?
In 1977, Jerry Mander theorized on something called alpha waves, which is the type of brain activity induced onto the brain by television, and is the effect of emotionless mind, a mind that is turned passive to the point of total incapacity to think.
Our children are going to grow up to be total mush-brained zombies. There's no hope for them.
The content kept on coming and the channels kept growing. Many beamed directly from space, culminating in the phenomenon dubbed reality TV, a scriptless, plotless, pointless, thoughtless, relentless genre that dished up all the experiences humans missed while sitting on their couches. Their lives. And yet, no one cared. Why go to the exhausting effort of living a life when you could absorb one on TV? Unless, of course, it was all part of a vast conspiracy. Decades in the making.
We've sort of submitted our judgment to the better judgment of television. Behind us is clearly a project of control and domination, which sooner or later will be revealed in the form of physical domination.
Your parents were right, your teachers were right, even that creepy scoutmaster with the tight brown shorts was right. TV is slowly rotting your brain and turning it into a slimy, gooey, mushy blob of pudding, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Once your brains are reduced to a cottage cheese like mush, we'll scoop them out with a melon bowler and gobble them right on up.
Because we're aliens.
That's kind of our thing.
Could it be? Could every actor, director, producer, technician, boom mic operator, editor, makeup artist, PA, could everyone in this seemingly innocuous industry be playing a part in some sort of diabolical conspiracy? Absolutely.
And there's nothing you can do about it. See? I just told you what was happening, and you're still watching TV. Amazing.
now you know. I'm Alec Baldwin. Enjoy the shows.
What are we going to do about it? We're going to do nothing about it. We're powerless in front of the square box. We're powerless in front of the apparatus. And to be honest with you, I want to keep watching Biggest Loser.
The media conglomerate Hulu clearly designed this series of commercials to poke fun at the effect Hollywood has upon its masses. Although they're intending it to be humorous, there is an amount of truth in every joke, otherwise it wouldn't be funny. In Hulu's case, they put it right in front of your face, telling you exactly what prolonged exposure to television is doing to you, and then gloat in the fact that the average person will stay plugged in. The slogan in the commercial series is worth noting.
Hulu, an evil plot to destroy the world. Enjoy.
The world was first introduced to the advertisements of Hulu during the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl 43, when the most eyes would be fixed on every frame of the game. It was not put on in the middle of the night when no one would be watching. Is the health of our minds really at stake? Is there any substantial evidence to what Mr. Alec Baldwin is saying? As everyone knows, entertainment is totally fake. But can it actually have an adverse effect upon your life? And if so, could there really be a diabolical plan to use Hollywood for some deeper deception?
You know, with today's media bombardment, we have televisions in every location you can possibly imagine. People put them in cars, they're in grocery store lines. Everywhere you go, we are saturated with media. What is actually really happening inside your brain as you sit and stare at these blinking lights? And moreover, is there some sort of diabolical plan to destroy the world using this media? Not everything you see on television is considered evil. Not everything is damaging to you. But what kinds of things are good to watch and what kinds of things are bad to watch? What we hope to achieve is that you will be able to make better choices of what you allow into your mind based on this information. We decided to start at the beginning to see what the media's impact was upon toddlers. There are many studies bubbling to the surface why children should not watch television.
Hi everyone, a new study found that 40% of 3-month-olds are regular TV watchers.
Would you believe that 1/3 of all 3-year-olds in America have a TV in their bedrooms?
No, I can't believe it.
Yeah,
it's kind of disturbing.
Did you know the average child spends nearly 45 hours a week watching TV or using other types of media, such as a computer? A report released today says this is having a negative impact on our children's health.
By the time they're toddlers, 90% are tuning in. That may be good news for the founders of a 24/7 channel for babies, but guess what? It's bad news for our kids.
Research gives parents more reason to keep infants and toddlers away from television.
Children need to interact with humans to develop healthy brains. And the Academy says children who watch 3 to 4 hours of non-educational TV every day will have seen almost 8,000 murders by the end of grade school. It doesn't take an Einstein, baby or otherwise, to understand what this means or to follow 3 little words of advice issued by the Academy.
It is time for toddlers and their parents to turn that TV off.
Turn it off.
You know, I think it's a misnomer to say that everything on TV is bad, is evil, has an agenda. In fact, it might be hypocritical for us to sit here and say that because obviously we work in production and we're creating this documentary. So we went back to the beginning to see how media affects the brain, more specifically children's brains. So we took a road trip up to Seattle to interview Dr. Dimitri Christakis, in where he has spent the better half of 15 years researching the developing brain and while it's being influenced by television.
The concern I had was that exposing the developing brain to the rapid sequencing of television programs, particularly baby DVDs, which are more rapidly sequenced even than normal television, would precondition the mind to expect high levels of input. And that would lead to shorter attention spans later in life. Reality couldn't, if you will, keep pace with the expectations that had been created by watching too much fast-paced programming later in life. And we found just that the more television that babies watched before the age of 3, the more likely they were to have attention problems later in life. Specifically, for each hour that they watched on a typical day, before the age of 3, their chances of having attentional problems were increased by about 10%. So to put that another way, a baby who watched 2 hours of TV a day before the age of 3 would be 20% more likely to have attentional problems at age 7 compared to a child who watched none. And we followed that initial study up by looking at what children watched, because as you might imagine, not all shows are paced the same. And if our hypothesis was right, then the more fast-paced programs they watched, the greater their risk would be of having attentional problems. And that's exactly what we found. The more fast-paced programs they watched, the higher their risk. Slow-paced programs, particularly those that took place in real time, didn't appear to increase the risk at all. So that was part of a series of early studies looking into what I call the overstimulation hypothesis, that you can overstimulate the developing brain. So our work has progressed now to developing a mouse model of this. And if you will, we have what in effect is mouse television, and we expose newborn mice to overstimulation. We have them watch television, which is to say we have lights flashing and sound piped into their cage for about 6 hours a day, starting at 10 days of life through their childhood. And then we test their cognitive and behavioral development. And then what we find is that the overstimulated mice have shorter attention spans, are greater risk takers, and have poorer cognitive development than the normally weird mice.
Now, when we're talking about children and you're exposing, or children are exposed to this, what age range are we really talking about? I mean, is there a difference between, a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, or 7-year-old?
In 1970, the average age at which children began to watch television regularly was 4 years of age. And today, it's closer to 4 months of age. And that rapid shift hasn't occurred so much over the last 40 years as it has over the last 15 years. There were no products that were aimed at children that young prior to about 15 years ago. So the advent of baby DVDs and all of their claims of making children smarter, more musical, more mathematical, have really successfully gotten parents to put their babies in front of the television. And because babies' brains are very much a work in progress, the effects of baby TV are very different than the effects of preschool television. And if we have a conversation about preschool television, you'll hear me say very, very different things. Because although I'm a firm believer that TV exposure before the age of 2 should really be minimized, after the age of 2, there are programs which, if used appropriately, don't pose any risk to children at all. In fact, have been shown in many studies to proffer benefit.
At a TED conference, Dr. Christakis showed that not every media production that is labeled educational is necessarily beneficial.
Which brings us to Baby Einstein. Now, many of you probably have not seen Baby Einstein, but I will show you a random 20-second clip from Baby Einstein Day on the Farm, and here it is. In that 20-second clip, there were 7 scene changes, about 1 every 3 seconds. It's about the most exhausting day on the farm since John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. And of course, it's nothing like being on a real farm, right? Adults watching this find it discombobulating because your mind is trying to make a coherent narrative out of this, and there is no coherent narrative. It jumps all over the place. But babies aren't trying to make a coherent narrative out of it. They're not capable of doing that. It's all of that screen change, all of that stimulation that's keeping them actually engaged in the screen. So we've had for a while what we call the overstimulation hypothesis, which is that prolonged exposure to this rapid image change during this critical window of brain development would precondition the mind to expect high levels of input, and that would lead to inattention in later life. So you watch enough Baby Einstein Day on the Farm as a baby, and when you go to a farm as a school-age child, it's boring. It's too slow. How come there's no sheep suddenly popping into my face? How come there's no marionette going back and forth? Why do I have to walk from here to there? That's the general idea, that you're conditioning the mind to that reality, which doesn't actually exist.
Is there a danger to exposing the mind to realities that don't really exist? If you just observe a small child at play, you'll notice that they're very active in their play, they're very animated. When you take that same child and you place them in front of the television, that activity stops. The same thing takes place in the mind. Parts of the mind simply stop. Watching television is a passive activity. You're not interacting with what you're seeing. A child's mind, to develop properly, needs to interact with the world around them, needs to interact with people especially. When you're born with billions of brain cells and trillions of connections can be made. By the age of 3, you have twice as many synapses as you do as an adult. I mean, think about it. Kids are constantly learning. They're interacting with their environment, and this is what's needed for proper brain development. The pathways haven't been formed yet. And as these pathways formed, as the child interacts with the world around them, interacts with the people around them, each time a neuron fires, there's a protein sheath that's laid down over the axon of the neuron. The myelinating of the neurons in the mind strengthens those neurons and strengthens those pathways. Between the ages of 6 and 7, there's an enzyme that's released into the brain that dissolves all poorly myelinated pathways. So any neuron that hasn't been used or hasn't been formed into a pathway and doesn't have a thick myelin sheath, it's dissolved, it's pruned, as it were. When you place children in front of television, there's no interaction, there's no real life movement or anything with what they're actually seeing. This situation has caused the American Pediatrics Association to recommend that children under the age of 2 should never be exposed to television. France has even taken it a bit further and said any child under the age of 3 should not be exposed to television, and has made it illegal to produce programming geared towards that age group. So what happens when you're an adult? When you're watching television, you're essentially staring at a blinking light, much like the mice in Christakis' experiment. If you've ever experienced a mind fog after watching television, you're not alone. The brain has 4 modes that it operates in, 4 brainwave patterns. Delta is when you're deep asleep, theta is when you're in light sleep, alpha is awake but relaxed. It's the mode of thinking that you are in when you're in the most heightened state of suggestibility. And then there's beta, the highest functioning mode, like when you're reading a book or you're having a very stimulating conversation. In 1969, Herbert Krugman did a study where he found that in less than 60 seconds, the human brain switched from beta brainwave patterns, those exhibited during logical thought, to alpha brainwave patterns. Alpha is not a bad brainwave pattern to be in, but when you're in that brainwave pattern a lot of the time, and if you look at the averages of how much people are watching television, this just leaves the mind unfocused and unable to concentrate.
Researchers have said that watching television is similar to staring at a blank wall for several hours. Robert Kuby did a study which appeared in Scientific America in 2002.
Looking at how people experienced television in the flow of their everyday life. And we used a beeper technology where we would beep people at intervals, and they would write down what they were doing, how they were feeling, and so on. And I was able to look at this stuff, and I was able to show and demonstrate like what kinds of days people experienced when they would watch more at night. And the answer to that was they felt not very good at work. They had a really bad day at work. I found that people who didn't have a good tolerance for what I called unstructured time watched more TV. And I would say this is probably true for use of the internet too. If you don't feel comfortable with yourself and you need to fill up that time when you're by yourself and you don't have anything else to do, then what are you going to do? You're going to gravitate to the easiest, most inexpensive medium that was ever invented, which is virtually free, television, and fill up your mind with something else. So it's a kind of form of escapism.
The effects of television on the mind are probably one of the most studied aspects of our society. And one of the things that takes place in the mind is that the frontal lobe is being bypassed. Within minutes of sitting down and watching television, the frontal lobe activity simply goes almost to nothing.
The frontal lobe of the brain is the seat of spirituality, morality, and the will. It's actually the analytical portion of our brain, and it's actually the decision maker. And so it's a crucial aspect in regards to our future success and happiness is how well our frontal lobe is functioning. And unfortunately, entertainment television suppresses the frontal lobe of the brain. Actually, in about 90 seconds of viewing it, the frontal lobe circulation begins to go down, and it actually has an adverse effect. And the interesting thing is people watch entertainment television often due to the fact that they feel a little depressed or anxious, and it kind of calms them. But in reality, it's a very short-term fix, and it's going to complicate things in the long run. Of course, I'm most known for the one who treats depression and anxiety. In fact, we treat the most severe forms of depression and anxiety. And what we have found is virtually every depressed patient will have about a 40% decrease in circulation and activity of the frontal lobe of the brain. And so we're trying to enhance the frontal lobe. And so, unfortunately, a lot of these gadgets that produce this overstimulation, they can be fun for the short term. But, there's more fun things to do than ever before in human history, but yet we have more depression than ever before in human history, more anxiety. Mental health problems are skyrocketing throughout the world. And the entertainment medium is one of the primary reasons why this is occurring. Studies will clearly demonstrate that when you go to entertainment as a way to either get fun and it becomes a habitual process, the risk of depression and anxiety will more than double.
So we decided to drive down to LA and to talk to a top neurologist and find out really what's happening with the frontal lobe when we watch television.
Well, each hemisphere has a prefrontal cortex, and it is, depending on how you measure it, 30 to 33% of the human neocortex. It has many functions which are often discussed in terms of cognition as executive abilities. I like to summarize it by having a role that you'd expect from a chief executive officer of a corporation, making strategic decisions, monitoring the performance of those activities, making corrections en route, and so on. It's also the source of social behavior. It turns out that humans are particularly visual animals. A lot of the information that is required for relating to the environment is visual. And so a lot of the posterior part of the neocortex is devoted to complex visual processing beyond the primary visual cortex. So that I think of it as a gradual reconstruction. What you see is not necessarily a carbon copy of reality. What you see is a gradual coding and reconstruction of the signal in neurologic terms. And in that process, a lot of interpretation goes on.
So Dr. Mendez says that the frontal lobe is like our command center. It's like where we make all these executed decision-making processes. That our perception of reality is based upon what we basically take in through our visual cortex. Now, question, could you change someone's reality based on what you give them visually to watch? Dr. Michael Rich, a media expert from Boston's Children's Hospital, wrote an article about what happens in your brain when you sit down and you watch a 3D movie, and here's what he says. So what does your brain do when it's sitting in a theater looking at a giant screen wearing 3D glasses and swimming in surround sound, processing 24 images that flip by per second? Your brain dutifully processes those stimuli and does little else. In fact, your prefrontal cortex, which is involved in impulse control, future thinking, and moral choices, is basically inactivated during this process. That is why you get lost in a movie. Also, researcher Jacob Jacoby found after testing 5,400 viewings that 83% of those viewers misunderstood or miscomprehended that which they watched only moments before. That's what happens when the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe is shut off.
One of the interesting things about educational TV, for instance, C-SPAN is educational TV. It may not be the greatest education, but it's one camera view and there's a senator up there giving a talk and giving a lecture. And you'll see something happen when you're in a room. You know, I being a doctor, there's a doctor's lounge at the hospital I'm at, and often doctors look for educational TV when they're there together. And you will see them stand up and begin to vehemently argue against the television set, because they'll say, you know what, he left this out. He left that out. He's not mentioning this. This is a very biased presentation. You will never see anyone argue with their television set when entertainment television is going on. You will see them actually just sitting there, accepting all this, maybe laughing or crying, but they're not going to argue with the set because they don't have the ability. They may vehemently disagree with what's going on that program, but they have no ability to actually bring forward that disagreement and start to logically go through the arguments in their mind because of the suppression of the frontal lobe of their brain.
Furthermore, research has shown that the limbic system cannot tell the difference between something that is real and not real. That's a job for the frontal lobes, or the prefrontal cortex, which is virtually shut off, remember? So what happens is your limbic system then reacts to television or a movie as if it's real. It releases the appropriate hormones of the fight or flight system in conjunction with the stresses that it places upon the body.